I texted the family group chat flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? My hands were still shaking from the graveside dirt I'd wiped off them in Seoul. I had buried my wife less than 12 hours earlier. My brother replied, "We're busy, try Uber." My mom added, "Why didn't you plan better?" And like a trained reflex, I typed back, "No worries." But that night when the news showed what happened to me after I walked into that freezing, flooded house, they dropped their phones like it was the first time they'd ever seen me bleed. I'm Cassian Holt, and this is the moment everything I thought I knew about family burned down to the foundation. Before I share my story, I want to know you're here with me. Just say, listening in the comments, or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection makes a heavy story feel a little less lonely. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if this kind of real human story matters to you, please consider subscribing. It helps more than you know, especially to someone who spent a long time believing no one was listening. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane began its descent into Denver, but my eyes were too raw, too swollen from 30 straight hours of travel and grief to adjust. I sat there 32, exhausted beyond reason, still wearing the same black shirt I'd buried my wife in 2 days earlier, feeling my skin crack under the recycled air. My spine locked from sleeping upright and my head pulsing with a slow, stubborn ache I'd carried since Seoul. For hours, one sentence had looped in my mind like a cruel screensaver. I just buried my wife on the other side of the world. My thumb rubbed the indentation on my wedding band until the metal warmed under my touch. For a split second, the image of Seraphine's grave, small, quiet, tucked beneath a line of pines on a hillside outside Seoul, flashed so vividly in my mind that I forgot where I was. The plane, the strangers, the hum of engines, they all vanished behind that single image. Then the captain spoke, breaking the trance, announcing our final approach. I swallowed hard and turned on my phone. Notifications exploded across the screen, emails from work, alerts from my bank, and a winter advisory warning Colorado residents to keep heat running because temperatures were dropping into dangerously low territory. I barely processed any of them. What I opened instead was the family group chat, Holt Crew. 4 members, my brother Nolan, my mother Marianne, my father Grant, and me, the one who always reached out first, the one who filled the silence when the rest of them didn't. My fingers hovered for a moment before typing. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? Simple. Reasonable. The kind of thing any family would rally around, especially after everything that had happened. But my family wasn't any family. I stared at the screen while we taxied, pretending not to anticipate the replies, but I did. I always did. I'd spent most of my life trying not to need too much, not to be an inconvenience, not to disrupt the rhythm of a household that had always spun around Nolan. A bubble appeared. Nolan. We're busy, try Uber. 8 words, not even a question mark. Not a, how are you holding up, or are you okay to ride alone after that flight? Just logistics, as if I'd asked him to pick up dry cleaning. A second bubble popped up before I could breathe. Mom. Why didn't you plan better? You know how full our schedules are. Her schedules, her bridge club, her dinner commitments, her social calendar she guarded like it was national security clearance. My father didn't bother typing, he just reacted to Nolan's message with a thumbs-up emoji. A gesture I'd seen so many times growing up that it had become almost a punctuation mark in our household. Good enough, moving on. I stared at the 3 responses. My throat tightened. I wanted to tell them the truth, that my hands were still shaking from lowering a casket into foreign soil, that I hadn't slept in days, that I had walked out of a cemetery carrying only a folded letter and the necklace Seraphine wore every morning. I wanted to say that I didn't have the strength to drag 3 suitcases across a frozen parking lot. I wanted to type, I just buried my wife. But the old instinct kicked in, the one that told me never to burden them, never to make things dramatic, never to expect more than they were willing to give. So I wrote, no worries, I'll figure it out. And just like that, I stepped back into the role I'd been assigned my whole life. The son who never needed too much. The brother who took the crumbs and said thank you. The man who solved his own emergencies, so no one else had to rearrange their precious schedules. The plane doors opened. A blast of cold air seeped into the cabin. Passengers grabbed their bags, eager to get home to family, to warmth. Meanwhile, all I had was a text thread full of people who treated my grief like a scheduling conflict. By the time I stepped into the terminal, the airport was buzzing with announcements about the incoming cold snap. Screens above the baggage claim flashed warnings. Expect frozen pipes. Keep heat running. Check your furnace. I rolled my aching shoulders and watched strangers hug relatives, kids run into grandparents' arms, couples reunite with tearful laughter. My own phone remained silent. I hauled my 3 suitcases, 2 filled with everything of Seraphine's I couldn't bear to leave behind, onto a cart and arranged a rideshare pickup. The price was nearly double the usual rate, but I tapped accept run without hesitation. Outside, the wind cut across the pavement, sharp and metallic. As I pushed the cart toward the pickup lane, I glanced at my phone one last time. The family group chat sat pinned at the top, the words, "No worries," glowing like a lie I had swallowed whole. I had no idea that before nightfall those same words would echo back at my family through a television screen, that by 10 p.m. the entire state would know exactly what I'd endured alone. At that moment, all I knew was that the cold was sinking through my coat and that the real storm, both the one outside and the one waiting for me at home, was only beginning. The car's heater blasted warm air, but none of it reached me. I sat in the back of the rideshare, forehead pressed against the cold glass, watching Denver's city lights smear into streaks of color. I barely registered the driver's soft humming, his fingers tapping the steering wheel, the muted radio report about plunging temperatures. Instead, my mind drifted backward because, to understand how I ended up returning to Colorado alone with my wife's favorite sweater folded in my bag and her wedding ring hanging on a chain around my neck, I had to go all the way back to where it began. Austin, Texas. A co-working space with too many Edison bulbs and too little actual lighting. A design workshop I was presenting at. A coffee machine that sputtered aggressively whenever someone ignored the "Do Not Overfill" sign. And Seraphine, veil-walking contradiction software engineer, the woman who dropped an entire cup of hot coffee onto my laptop as she tried to squeeze past a group reaching for pastries. She froze. I froze. My laptop hissed, and then she burst into the most unfiltered laugh I'd ever heard. "Okay," she said, brushing her hair back and looking directly at me. "If I buy you a new laptop, will you forgive me? Or do you prefer coffee sacrifices daily?" I remember thinking, who laughs like that at a disaster? Who looks that alive at 9 in the morning? She insisted on buying me another drink that wouldn't kill my electronics, and we sat at a corner table talking about everything. UX coding the absurdity of the workshop snacks, why Austin felt like a city still figuring out its personality. My phone buzzed non-stop during that conversation. The whole crew group chat was going wild over Nolan's newest sales award. Memes, photos, my mother's proud paragraphs written like a press release. Not one person noticed I was presenting that morning, even though I'd told them 2 weeks earlier. Seraphine saw the notifications lighting up my screen. She raised an eyebrow. "Your family's enthusiastic," she said, "but none of them asked how your talk went." I shrugged. I'd spent my whole life shrugging off things that hurt. From that day on, everything with her moved effortlessly: late-night coding sessions, takeout dinners on the couch, debates about UI patterns, laughter that filled every inch of our little Austin apartment. When remote work became permanent, I suggested moving somewhere quieter. Boulder called to both of us: mountains, seasons, fresh air, a place where we could build something new. My family was less thrilled. Colorado was too far, too inconvenient for holidays, too remote for my mother's taste. Nolan asked about salaries, first support second. Classic. But we moved anyway. Bought a small house with a yard big enough for her to plant sunflowers. She baked on Sundays, dancing barefoot in the kitchen while I sat at my desk facing the Rockies, wondering how I got so lucky. We talked about kids, names, how we'd raise them. How the office could easily turn into a nursery. For months I'd walk past that room and picture her decorating it. And now, the room was still there, still full of papers and half-finished projects, frozen in time. The memory tightened like a knot in my throat. Then came the offer from a Seoul-based AI firm, a paid contract that could push her career forward for years. The night she told me about it, she kept apologizing, worried it would take her too far from me. But I told her to go, that we'd handle the distance, that it was 1 year, that love could stretch across oceans. My family had predictable reactions. Nolan is the compensation worth the hassle, Mom. 1 year. What about giving me grandchildren? No one said we're proud of you. No one ever said that. I felt ashamed as I introduced her to friends at our farewell dinner in Austin, babbling excuses for why my family couldn't make it. Again. On the day she flew to Seoul, I walked her to security. My family texted a single safe travels. Right before she stepped through the gate, she leaned in close and whispered, "If anything ever happens to me, don't let anyone tell you you're asking for too much." At the time, I laughed it off. Now in the back of that ride share with Denver blurring by those words hit me harder than the turbulence that tossed our plane an hour earlier. I pressed my forehead harder against the glass, letting the cold numb the sting in my eyes. Outside, the lights of the city flickered by like ghosts of a life that felt impossibly far away. I didn't know yet that I was heading home to an empty house. I didn't know yet that frozen pipes would burst, that carbon monoxide would fill the rooms, that by midnight I'd be unconscious and hypothermic, and that a neighbor's 911 call, not my family, would save my life. For now, all I had were memories of Seraphine, warm, bright, alive, and the sharp, cutting truth settling deeper in my chest. She had seen everything clearly long before I did. The last few weeks played in reverse, as if someone had spliced together pieces of a film I never wanted to watch again. Just a few days before everything shattered, Seraphine and I had ended a morning video call the way we always did, her sitting cross-legged on her apartment floor in Seoul hair, in a messy bun, eyes tired but still teasing. She mentioned a headache that had been bothering her for hours, brushing it off with a laugh, blaming the all-nighter she'd pulled for a project deadline. I told her to rest. She told me she would, but we both knew she probably wouldn't. 8 hours later, while I was eating reheated leftovers in Boulder, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a rush of Korean and broken English tumbled into my ears so fast I could barely understand. A co-worker of hers was shouting over the chaos around him, something about her collapsing mid-meeting, being rushed to the ER, a possible aneurysm, the doctors working on her. I stood there, frozen fork still in my hand, unable to form words. He apologized for his English, but it wasn't the language barrier that made everything incomprehensible. It was the sheer terror of imagining her alone in that hospital. I booked the next flight I could find. Boulder to Denver, Denver to LAX, LAX to Seoul. Every layover was a blur of fluorescent lighting and airport chairs. At the boarding gate, I sent a message to the family group chat explaining that Seraphine was in critical condition. The replies came quickly, but hollow. Keep us posted. Let us know what the doctors say. Not a single question about me. Not one offer to help. The subtext was clear. Update us, but don't ask for anything more. When I finally reached the hospital in Seoul, a nurse led me through a maze of hallways into the ICU. The smell of disinfectant hung thick in the air. Machines beeped steadily, their patterns too calm for what I felt inside. Seraphine lay in a bed surrounded by tubes and wires, her skin pale, her chest rising and falling only because the ventilator forced it to. A doctor with kind eyes explained quietly that an aneurysm had ruptured. The damage was massive. The chances were slim. I sat beside her, telling her about the snow in Boulder, about the bakery she loved on Pearl Street, about the silly joke she'd made just days ago. I talked because the silence terrified me. I talked because I couldn't bear the thought that she might slip away without hearing my voice one last time. Later, when a nurse checked her chart, I glanced over and froze. Under emergency contacts, the first name listed was mine. The second was her former professor in Austin. There was no mention of my parents, my brother, or anyone from the Holt family. That line on the page hit me harder than anything the doctors had said. It confirmed something she'd been trying to show me for years in her life. I was the family. My family in her eyes were strangers. When I called my mother to tell her the severity of the situation, her first question was whether insurance would cover the hospital stay. She wanted to make sure we weren't letting ourselves get overcharged. Nolan said that if things looked too grim, maybe I should consider bringing her back to the States quickly so costs wouldn't escalate. No one asked if I was alone. No one asked if I had slept, eaten, or had support. When I asked if they could come to Seoul if things got worse, my mother hesitated, then said the flights were too expensive and she had social commitments she couldn't miss. 3 days later, the doctors called me into a consultation room. The ceiling lights buzzed faintly. I stared at the table while they explained that her brain had no meaningful activity, that she wasn't in pain but wouldn't recover, that keeping her on machines would only prolong what little was left of her life. My signature felt like the heaviest thing I had ever written. The funeral happened in a modest chapel outside Seoul. A handful of her colleagues came. A few American expats I'd never met showed up with flowers offering their condolences quietly. I propped my phone on a small stand and started a video call to include my family. My mother complained about the lighting hurting her eyes and left the call early. Nolan stayed on for a few minutes before announcing he had to jump onto a client meeting. My father didn't say anything at all. After the service, I checked our group chat. One message awaited me. You did what you could. Now focus on getting home and sorting things out. No one wrote "We're sorry." No one asked how I was standing upright. The days after the funeral were a blur of paperwork. I ran back and forth between government offices, translators, and the U.S. consulate. When I inquired about bringing her body home, the cost was staggering, far beyond anything I could manage. Insurance would only cover a portion. Exhausted and nearly out of money, I made a choice I never imagined I'd have to bury her in Seoul, not in the place she once called home. My mother's response when I informed her was just another blow. Do whatever you think is reasonable. Just don't take out loans from us. I picked a burial plot on a quiet hillside overlooking maple trees turning red in the winter cold. I tucked a worn paperback, a small photo, and a Rockies keychain beside the headstone during my last visit before flying out. I told her I would come back. I promised I would keep going, even though I no longer understood how. As I walked back toward the exit, 2 of her coworkers whispered to each other, glancing at me with pity. One said softly, "Usually family comes." The words stung more than the cold wind. By the time I boarded my flight back to the U.S., I was nearly maxed out on my credit card, drained in every possible way. I remember staring at the flight map on the screen in front of me, a thin blue line stretching across the Pacific, thinking the worst was behind me. I thought I was going home to rest, to recover, to let myself fall apart in familiar walls. But whatever I imagined as safe or home no longer existed. And the real storm, the one waiting for me in Boulder, hadn't even begun. The drive from Denver International Airport to Boulder felt endless. I sat slumped in the back seat of the rideshare, my head heavy against the window, the city lights dissolving into streaks of white and gold. The driver, Paul, tried to make gentle conversation, asking how my trip had been. I muttered something vague, unwilling to let the words "I buried my wife alone on the other side of the world" escape my mouth. Saying it would have broken me. My phone buzzed. More messages from the family group chat. I didn't open them. Letting them sit there felt like a punishment I deserved for still expecting something different, for hoping they might have changed in the span of a few days. The radio murmured warnings about a coming cold front, temperatures dropping below zero, pipes freezing, heating systems needing to stay on through the night. I listened distantly, never imagining those warnings would become the thread connecting everything that happened next. Paul pulled into my driveway just as dusk fell. The air outside was sharp enough to sting my lungs. I dragged my suitcases up the steps, unlocked the door, and stepped into complete darkness. The house felt frozen, still untouched. I flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. My stomach tightened. The temperature inside was bitter. I checked the thermostat off. Completely off. Before leaving for Seoul, I had asked my mother to turn the heat on the day before I returned. She'd agreed without hesitation, yet the screen blinked blankly, lifeless. I walked into the kitchen hoping to find something, anything that made the place feel less abandoned. The refrigerator held only condiments long expired and a few containers of food mottled with mold. Nolan had promised he'd restock the fridge for me. Another promise evaporated. A wave of tiredness hit me so hard I dropped onto the sofa instead of going upstairs to our bedroom. I couldn't bring myself to open the suitcases. I knew her clothes were inside folded by someone else's hands. I texted the family a quick, "Just got home." No one replied. I forced myself to assume they were busy. The cold crept deeper as I fell asleep in my coat, curled awkwardly on the couch. It wasn't restful sleep, just unconsciousness pulling me under for a few hours. Morning arrived violently. I woke to the sound of water dripping, then rushing like a downpour inside my house. For a second, half dreaming, I thought it was raining in Seoul. Then I sat up. Water poured from the ceiling in streams, through the light fixtures, down the walls, across the cabinets. I waded through a shallow pool forming on the kitchen floor. The pipes in the ceiling had burst overnight, frozen solid with no heat running to protect them. The warnings I'd ignored on the radio came back like a cruel taunt. I scrambled to find an emergency plumber. Every line I called said the same thing: too many burst pipes, earliest appointment in 3 to 4 days. The house kept flooding while my breath fogged in front of me. In desperation, I called Nolan. I told him the house was unlivable, the temperature freezing, and asked if I could stay with him for a few nights. He said their guest room was full of storage boxes and that he and his wife were hosting a dinner with clients that evening. He suggested I get a motel or file an insurance claim. When I called my mother, she said she was preparing for her bridge club to meet the next day and didn't want to disrupt the arrangement. She added that my father's back was bothering him and he couldn't handle extra stress. She urged me not to overreact and to find a solution on my own. My father came on the line for a moment, told me to stay warm, and handed the phone back to her. Standing in the freezing water pooling at my feet, I realized that if I were drowning, they'd still ask me to schedule it around their plans. The lights began flickering. Water had seeped into the fixtures, and a plumber on the phone warned me to shut off some of the circuits to avoid a fire. Groggy and lightheaded, I went down to the basement to find the electrical panel. The stairs were slick. The basement floor glistened with a thin sheet of water. I shuffled toward the panel, telling myself it would only take a second. My hand touched the metal box, and at that exact moment my foot slid. I fell, my arm striking the panel. A sharp current shot up my arm. Pain snapped through my chest. The world blinked out for an instant. When everything came back, I was on the floor, head throbbing, the side of my face wet with blood. I wasn't thinking clearly. I crawled back upstairs, forcing myself onto the sofa. The air in the house had grown colder. My fingers numbed. I could barely hold my phone. The carbon monoxide detector began screaming from somewhere behind me, but the sound seemed distant, swallowed by the fog creeping through my mind. I tried reaching for my phone again. My muscles refused to cooperate. My vision tunneled. A single fractured thought drifted through me. Maybe this wouldn't be the worst way to go. Maybe I'd see her again. What happened next, I learned only after waking up in the hospital. Diane Foster, my neighbor across the street, noticed water pouring from beneath my front door. She heard the CO alarm blaring inside. When I didn't answer her knocking, she called 911. Firefighters broke down the door and found me unconscious, hypothermic, with dangerously high CO exposure. One of them picked up my phone from the floor. The screen lit up with the last messages in the Holt crew chat. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? We're busy. Try Uber. Why didn't you plan better? No worries. Those 4 lines glowing from a cracked screen in a freezing house became the unintentional prelude to everything that followed on the local news later that night. I came to in a blindingly white room, the steady beep of a monitor syncing with the pounding inside my skull. My right arm was wrapped, my clothes were gone, and despite the blankets, I felt cold deep in my bones. Nurse Sarah explained what happened in the calmest voice imaginable: hypothermia, carbon monoxide, poisoning, a concussion, and electrical trauma. Another hour or 2, she said, and you might not have woken up. The thought hit harder than the shock itself. While I lay unconscious in a freezing house, my family had been living a completely normal evening: bridge club, dinner plans, client meetings. None of them knew. None had checked. Sarah began the intake questions. Who do you live with? Anyone nearby to help? When I told her my wife had died less than 2 weeks ago in Seoul, she put her pen down and really looked at me. You went through all of that alone? She asked. I nodded. She wrote something in my chart-limited family support, and for once the words felt accurate. What I didn't know was that my case had already caught someone's attention. A paramedic talking to a reporter covering storm injuries mentioned the man who just buried his wife overseas and almost froze to death alone. When he added the detail about my phone still open to the messages, "We're busy, try Uber." The reporter Michael Chen stopped and asked more questions. By evening, a full segment had formed. A Colorado man returns from his wife's overseas funeral, is denied a ride by family, and nearly dies after pipes burst during a historic freeze. They interviewed Diane, the neighbor, who called 911 after seeing water pouring under my door. A firefighter described the CO levels inside my house. A graphic reenacted my text messages. No names, but the story didn't need them. That night, Jessica, the night nurse, hesitated before turning on the TV. "You might want to see this," she said. I watched in silence as my life, my grief, my near death, my family's messages played out in front of thousands of people. Hearing a reporter read, "Why didn't you plan better?" felt like someone peeling open the part of me I'd been trying so hard to hold together. Within hours, screenshots spread online. Comments poured in. A hashtag built around my last message. No worries circulated with stories from strangers who had been dismissed by their own families. My parents and Nolan saw it too. Friends and colleagues started texting them, asking whether the man on TV was me. And that's why close to midnight my hospital door swung open. Nolan came in first, then my mother with a convenience store bouquet, then my father. They looked panicked, not with fear of losing me, but fear of what people thought. "Oh, Cassian," my mother said, smoothing her coat. "That report made everything sound terrible. People are misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Not what happened to me, but how they looked." For the first time, I saw them clearly. The next morning, Dr. Patel explained my discharge needs no being alone for 48 hours, constant monitoring, heat meals, rest. Before he finished, my mother jumped in. "He'll come home with us. Family sticks together." Nolan nodded. "We've rearranged our schedules. The same people who rejected me 48 hours earlier now volunteered full-time support because a doctor was present and the public was watching." Dr. Patel turned to me. "What do you want, Cassian?" The question stunned me. No one in my family had asked that in years. After the doctor left, Jessica checked my vitals and lowered her voice. "You don't have to go with them if it doesn't feel right. We have options." The social worker later outlined them: a hotel offering me 2 free weeks, a restoration company repairing my home neighbor's rotating check-ins. My mother bristled. "He doesn't need strangers. This is a family matter," Nolan added. "If he accepts all that, people will think we abandoned him." The social worker asked quietly, "Did you—" Their silence was answer enough. I looked at them, my mother twisting her ring. Nolan scrolling nervously through notifications, my father staring at the floor. Then I heard Seraphine's voice in my memory. "Don't let anyone tell you you're asking for too much." I took a breath. "I'm choosing the hotel," I said. "I'm not ready to go with you." My mother stiffened. "You're embarrassing us." I answered. "I nearly died alone in my house. That embarrassment isn't mine." The room went silent. For the first time, I didn't back down. I didn't apologize. I chose what kept me alive, not what kept them comfortable. As the snow fell outside the hospital window, the social worker handed me the hotel paperwork. Jessica squeezed my shoulder. My family stood in a corner whispering, shaken not by my brush with death, but by losing control. And I realized this was the first decision in my life that truly belonged to me. My first days at the Denver hotel felt unreal. I stepped into a warm lobby, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air, a receptionist greeting me by name with a soft, "We're sorry for your loss." In my room waited a small gift basket and a handwritten card. "The community is here for you." It struck me that strangers had done more for me in 48 hours than my family had done in months. The social worker encouraged me to join a grief support group. The room was simple folding chairs, a whiteboard, quiet faces carrying their own storms. When it was my turn, I told the story fully for the first time: Seoul, the funeral alone, the empty airport ride, the freezing house, the CO alarm, the neighbor who saved me. A man across the circle said he'd seen the news, but hearing it from you is different. For once, my story wasn't treated like a headline, it was heard as pain. A few days later, Michael Chen asked for a follow-up interview. I hesitated, but the social worker's question lingered. Do you want others to shape your story, or do you want to? I agreed under the condition that I wouldn't name my family. Before filming, he showed me an email from someone with my family's last name asking the station to correct misunderstandings because the report made them look bad. I felt something inside me settle. If anyone was going to define the truth, it needed to be me. During the interview, I spoke plainly about grief, about needing only the basics: presence, warmth. One small act of care, and how strangers had stepped in where family hadn't. I said, I'm not telling this to shame anyone. I'm telling it for the people who think they're asking for too much when they're only asking not to be left alone. The segment aired that night. My phone flooded with missed calls from my mother and Nolan. When I finally answered, they accused me of airing private matters and making them look heartless. For the first time, I didn't apologize. If someone sees themselves in what I said, I told them that isn't my fault. Around that time, I kept thinking about Seoul, about how lost I felt navigating everything alone. Seraphine had once dreamed of helping students study abroad without fear of emergencies, so I contacted our old university to establish a small scholarship in her name. The school told me a local foundation would match my contribution if I agreed to speak at the announcement. I flew to Texas for the ceremony. It was simple: students, faculty, a few reporters. I talked about Seraphine's courage, about the strangers who became my safety net, about how family is sometimes found, not inherited. When I finished, I noticed someone standing in the back near the door: my father. He didn't approach me. He didn't say a word. But he had been there the whole time. Days later, the university emailed to thank me and mentioned an anonymous donor who'd added a significant amount to the scholarship from someone trying to do a little better. I didn't need to ask who it was. I simply wrote back, leave it anonymous. The scholarship matters more than the name attached to it. Back in Boulder, my house felt different, warmer, safer. The restoration team had repaired everything: new flooring, insulated pipes, a smart thermostat set to keep the house from ever freezing again. Diane brought soup and said she'd only relax once she saw steam coming from your chimney again. A few days later, I opened my mailbox to find an envelope addressed in my father's handwriting. He wrote that he had listened to my entire speech at the scholarship event, that seeing himself reflected in my words was painful but true. He admitted he'd been absent not just during the blizzard but during countless moments across my life, and for the first time he didn't offer excuses. He simply said he wanted a chance to start somewhere honest. I wrote back, setting boundaries with a clarity I'd never had before. If we were to build anything, it had to be as two adults meeting on neutral ground, not a son performing for a family that wouldn't show up. He replied, Saturday, Maple Street Diner. I'll be early. Our first conversation was awkward, almost silent. The next one went deeper. He spoke about fear, about choosing peace over truth, about feeling proud of Nolan because it was easier than understanding me. He said he envied the way I'd spoken publicly about pain, something he'd never dared to do in his entire life. I didn't forgive him on the spot, but I acknowledged the effort. It was small, but real. Meanwhile, my relationship with my mother and Nolan settled into a polite distance. They sent holiday greetings, photos from dinners, comments that avoided every hard thing. I answered briefly, without resentment, but without hope they would suddenly become different people. I no longer needed them to. A year after Seraphine died, I flew back to Seoul, this time to keep a promise not to survive a catastrophe. I visited the hospital and donated to a fund for international families. A nurse recognized me from the prior year and said their support program had improved after hearing stories like mine. At the cemetery, I sat before Seraphine's stone and told her everything: the freezing night, the neighbor, the hospital, the scholarship, my father's letter. I said I still missed her fiercely, but grief was no longer swallowing me. It had become something quieter, a companion, not a weight.